Chelmsley Wood was quiet in the days after Christmas. Rows of council houses sat beneath a gray winter sky, fairy lights still glowing faintly in living room windows, reminders that the holiday had only just passed. Inside those houses were families doing what families do between Christmas and New Year, eating leftovers, watching television, letting time slow down. David Spencer and Patrick Warren were part of that ordinary world. David was 13, old enough to feel grown, young enough to still be a child. He was described as confident, streetwise, the kind of boy who knew the estate and moved through it without fear. Patrick was 11, smaller, quieter, still very much in the space between childhood and adolescence. Where David led, Patrick followed. They lived close to one another. Same estate, same streets, same routines. Their families knew where they were most of the time, or at least they thought they did. In Chelmsley Wood, kids walked between houses freely. Friends stayed over. Nobody worried too much about a couple of boys heading out together after Christmas. It was 1996. There were no smartphones, no tracking apps, no instant way to know where someone had gone once they stepped outside. They weren't running away. They weren't planning an adventure. They told their families they were going to stay over at a relative's house, something that had happened before, something that raised no alarms. Patrick had his new pride and joy with him, a red Apollo bicycle, a Christmas present he'd only just unwrapped days earlier. It was the kind of gift a child never lets out of sight. To anyone watching, they would have looked like two ordinary boys on an ordinary night. No arguments, no distress, no reason to remember them. But this was the last time their families would see them. The last time anyone could say with certainty, this is who they were, before they became something else entirely. Boxing Day blurred into night. The excitement of Christmas had faded, replaced by that familiar quiet that settles in once the wrapping paper is gone and the house feels smaller again. Outside, the estate was calm. Streetlights cast long orange pools across wet pavements. Somewhere in the distance, a television murmured through a thin wall. David and Patrick were restless. They told their families they were going to stay over at Patrick's brother's house. It wasn't unusual. Sleepovers happened. Kids moved between homes on the estate all the time. There was no argument at the door, no hesitation, just coats pulled on, shoes tied, and a casual goodbye. Patrick wheeled his red Apollo bike beside him, new, clean, still carrying the excitement of Christmas morning. David walked alongside, hands in pockets, confident, familiar with every shortcut and pathway. They stepped out into the cold air and disappeared down the street. No one marked the time. No one thought to ask exactly when they'd be back. After all, they were just going to a relative's house. Just a short journey. Just another night in Chelmsley Wood. But they never arrived. As the hours passed, houses settled into sleep. Lights went out, roads emptied. Somewhere between leaving home and where they were meant to be, the ordinary rhythm of the night broke, quietly, without noise or witnesses. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the boys were already gone. And the night that had begun like so many others had turned into the last evening anyone would ever be able to trace. Just after midnight, the estate was almost silent. Boxing Day had ended. Christmas lights still blinked in windows, but the streets themselves were empty. The kind of quiet that only comes when most people are asleep and the night feels like it belongs to no one. David and Patrick were seen then. Inside a petrol station not far from Chelmsley Wood, a member of staff noticed two boys come in from the cold. They didn't cause trouble. They didn't rush. They stood at the counter like kids often do, lingering, uncertain, not quite ready to go back outside. The attendant spoke to them briefly. Nothing about the moment felt important at the time. No warning signs, no fear. Just two boys out late, killing time. Before they left, the attendant handed them a packet of biscuits, a small kindness, a forgettable gesture. It would become the last confirmed interaction anyone ever had with them. They walked back out into the night. Somewhere beyond the glow of the station lights, the darkness closed in again. Roads stretched away in every direction. Footpaths disappeared between houses and trees. After that moment, there are no witnesses, no CCTV, no phone calls, no trace of where they went or who they may have met. Later, when police reconstructed the timeline, everything stopped here. After midnight, after the biscuits, after the petrol station doors closed behind them, whatever happened to David Spencer and Patrick Warren happened next, unseen, unheard, and never fully explained. And from that moment on, time began to work against them. It was found behind the petrol station. Tucked away near a set of bins, partially hidden from view, sat Patrick's red Apollo bicycle, the same one he'd received for Christmas just days earlier. New, unmarked, exactly where it shouldn't have been. For investigators, the bike changed everything. Up until that point, there was still room for uncertainty. Maybe the boys had wandered off. Maybe they'd gone somewhere unexpected. Maybe they'd return on their own. But the bicycle told a different story. Patrick would not have left it behind willingly. It wasn't broken. It hadn't been damaged. There were no signs of a crash, no scraped paint, no bent wheel. It had simply been placed there, as if someone wanted it out of sight, close enough to where the boys were last seen, but far enough to avoid attention. The location mattered. The petrol station marked the final confirmed point in their journey. The bike being abandoned nearby suggested something had happened quickly. After they left the lights, after they stepped back into the dark, police searched the surrounding area, paths, waste ground, woodland, roads leading away from the station. But nothing else was found. No clothing, no footprints, no further belongings, just the bike. A Christmas present that never made it home. A silent object standing in for two boys who were suddenly gone. From that moment on, the idea that David and Patrick had simply run away became harder to believe. Children don't abandon brand new bikes. They don't leave them hidden behind bins in the middle of the night. The red Apollo bicycle didn't explain what happened, but it made one thing painfully clear. Whatever occurred after midnight was not part of the plan. At first, there was no panic. Morning came, and with it the ordinary routines of the estate. Curtains opened, kettles boiled. Somewhere, a parent expected to hear a door open, expected to see two boys walk back in, tired, hungry, apologetic for staying out late. But David and Patrick didn't come home. Hours passed, then more. Families began making phone calls, checking addresses, retracing the short journey the boys were supposed to have taken. Patrick's brother hadn't seen them. No one had. When police were contacted, the response was measured, calm, familiar. They'll come back. They're probably just staying with friends. They've likely run off for a bit. It was a conclusion reached quickly, too quickly. Two boys, after Christmas, assumed to have wandered off on their own. The case was treated as a potential runaway situation, not an emergency. Critical hours slipped away. No immediate cordons, no rapid response, no urgent assumption that something had gone wrong. By the time the seriousness of the situation began to register, the trail was already cooling. Footprints had been walked over, memories blurred. The night had erased itself. Behind the scenes, families grew frantic. This wasn't like them. They wouldn't disappear without saying something. Patrick wouldn't leave his bike behind, but those details came later. By the time the red Apollo bicycle was fully factored in, by the time concern turned into fear, the window where answers are easiest to find had already closed. Chelmsley Wood began to feel different. Parents called their children in early. Streets that once felt familiar suddenly felt exposed. The idea that two boys could vanish without a sound began to settle in, heavy, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. They'll come back, stopped being reassurance. It became a sentence that haunted everything that followed. By the time the searches began, the estate was already holding its breath. Police officers moved through Chelmsley Wood door to door, asking the same questions again and again. Had anyone seen the boys, heard anything in the early hours, noticed a car stopping, an argument, a shout in the night? Most people hadn't, or couldn't be sure anymore. Days had passed. Search teams spread out across the area, footpaths, patches of woodland, waste ground, places children were known to cut through. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers joined the effort. Posters went up in shop windows and on lampposts, the boys' faces suddenly everywhere. Nothing turned up. No clothing, no belongings, no sign of a struggle. The absence itself became unsettling. It was as if David and Patrick had simply stepped out of the world and left nothing behind. As the searches widened, fear began to take hold. This wasn't just about two missing boys anymore. It was about the possibility that someone had been watching, waiting, that something had happened in plain sight without anyone noticing. Parents stopped letting children walk alone. Familiar shortcuts were avoided. The estate, once ordinary, now felt edged with unease. Behind the scenes, the investigation struggled with what it didn't have. No witnesses after midnight, no CCTV, no clear direction to follow. Every path led back to the same place, the petrol station. And from there, the trail went cold. Chelmsley Wood had been searched, questioned, and mapped. But whatever happened to David Spencer and Patrick Warren had happened beyond the reach of those early searches. And as the days turned into weeks, the question no one could answer grew louder. How do two boys disappear from their own neighborhood without a trace? Years passed with no answers. The posters faded, the searches ended. Chelmsley Wood learned to live with the absence, two empty spaces where David and Patrick should have grown up. But the investigation never fully closed. It lingered, waiting for something or someone. Then a name began to surface: Brian Field. He wasn't from the estate. He wasn't someone the boys' families knew. But to police, his past was impossible to ignore. Field was a convicted pedophile and murderer, serving a life sentence for the abduction, sexual assault, and killing of a teenage boy decades earlier. The similarities were troubling. Field had targeted children. He had used deception. He had operated quietly, without witnesses. When detectives began re-examining unsolved cases involving missing boys, his name appeared again and again in background checks and intelligence reports. He had lived in the wider Midlands area at the time. He had access to vehicles. He had opportunity. For the first time, the disappearance of David Spencer and Patrick Warren was being discussed not as a tragedy without cause, but as a potential double murder. Police interviewed Field in prison. He denied everything. No confession, no slip, no admission, and critically, no physical evidence linking him to the boys. Nothing that could place him in Chelmsley Wood that night. Nothing that could explain the abandoned bicycle or what happened after the petrol station doors closed. Despite the suspicion, the case stalled again. Field would never be charged in relation to David and Patrick's disappearance. He would die without answering the questions that followed him. For the families, the emergence of a suspect brought something cruelly familiar: hope followed by frustration, a name but no resolution, a shadow but no proof. And so the case returned to silence. Two boys, one suspect, and still no truth. The mystery didn't disappear, it simply waited. The interviews changed nothing on the surface. Brian Field was questioned more than once, his past laid out in front of him, his movements scrutinized, his words weighed carefully. Detectives pressed where they could, revisiting the same details, hoping for cracks, a contradiction, a hesitation, something that might open the door. Nothing did. Field denied knowing David Spencer and Patrick Warren, denied seeing them, denied being anywhere near Chelmsley Wood that night. Without witnesses, without forensic evidence, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. And that was the problem. This was a case built on absence. No bodies, no crime scene, no moment that could be definitively labeled as the point where everything went wrong. Suspicion alone wasn't enough. Police could not charge a man simply because his past made him capable of the crime. Capability was not proof. Opportunity was not evidence. And motive, without something tangible to support it, was useless in court. So the questions remained unanswered. Why were two boys together taken or intercepted without anyone seeing? Why was the bike abandoned but nothing else? Why did no one come forward with information even years later? Each interview ended the same way it began, with denials, paperwork, and another quiet return to uncertainty. For the families, it was another reopening of old wounds. Each mention of a suspect raised expectations, only to let them fall again. Every interview promised progress. Every outcome delivered nothing. Brian Field would die in prison, never charged, never cleared, never explaining why his name had become attached to the disappearance of two boys he claimed never to have met. And with his death, one possible path to the truth closed forever. What remained was a case that refused to resolve, suspended between suspicion and silence, with no one left to question and nothing new to follow. As the years stretched on, the case refused to stay buried. New detectives reviewed old files. Fresh eyes traced timelines that had been memorized decades earlier. And when rumors surfaced, fragments of information, half-remembered statements, police returned to the ground itself, literally. Search teams excavated areas of land linked to persons of interest. Fields, isolated plots, places that had once seemed insignificant were suddenly treated as potential burial sites. Earth was turned over carefully, methodically, in the hope that time had not erased everything. Nothing was found, no remains, no clothing, no personal effects. Each dig ended the same way, with equipment packed away and silence settling back over the site. For the families, these moments were brutal. Every excavation carried the weight of possibility. Every negative result meant the same thing: no answers again. Public appeals were renewed. Decades after the boys vanished, police stood before cameras asking the same question they had asked in 1996. Did anyone see something? Did anyone hear something? Did someone know more than they were willing to say? Time had changed the estate. Buildings were replaced, roads reworked, people moved away, memories faded or hardened into uncertainty. Someone who might have been too frightened to speak as a teenager could now be an adult with nothing left to lose. But still, no one came forward with the missing piece. The case remained open, not active, not closed, suspended in between. A file revisited, then returned to storage. A name mentioned, then set aside. Digging for answers had become less about the ground beneath their feet and more about the past itself. And the deeper investigators went, the more they realized how much had already been lost to time. As hope began to thin, the case moved beyond Chelmsley Wood. David Spencer and Patrick Warren were no longer just missing boys from a Birmingham estate. Their faces were carried into kitchens across the country, printed on milk cartons, staring out from supermarket fridges. Two young faces paired with a single word: missing. It was one of the first times the UK had used the American-style milk carton campaign. Every morning, families poured milk and saw them. Names, ages, a date that never changed. The idea was simple. Someone, somewhere, might recognize them. Someone might remember something they'd dismissed years earlier. But recognition never came. The images froze the boys in time. David at 13, Patrick at 11, forever children. While everyone else aged, their faces stayed the same, becoming symbols rather than sons, brothers, friends. Media coverage followed. Newspapers revisited the case. Television segments replayed the same grainy photographs, the same unanswered questions. Each time the story resurfaced, it reopened wounds for the families. Hope briefly reignited, only to fade again. For the public, the boys became part of a wider fear. If two children could disappear without a trace after a normal day from a familiar place, then it could happen anywhere. The case shifted how people thought about safety, about letting children walk alone, about the thin line between ordinary life and irreversible loss. But despite the exposure, despite the national attention, nothing changed. No calls that led anywhere. No sightings that stood up to scrutiny. No breakthrough. The milk cartons were eventually replaced. Campaigns ended. Shelves were restocked. But David and Patrick never left. They remained frozen in those images. Two boys caught in a moment just before everything went dark, carried quietly into millions of homes, asking a question no one could answer. Time moved forward, but for the families, nothing ever changed. Parents returned to empty houses, rooms still holding the echoes of children who should have grown into teenagers, then young men. Birthdays passed without celebration. Christmas mornings came and went, with chairs left empty. Every milestone became a reminder of absence. The families became experts in waiting and in uncertainty. Calls were made to police, letters written, appeals launched, all in the hope that someone, somewhere, might finally break the silence. Volunteers joined searches. Local media covered anniversaries. But hope was a fragile thing, often crushed beneath the weight of passing years. Every sighting tip was a heartbreak. Every maybe turned into a no. A stranger's recollection faded into nothing. A witness who might have remembered the boys better in the daylight of youth had grown older, more cautious, or simply moved on. Yet the families never stopped asking the same question: where are David and Patrick? For decades, that question hung over Chelmsley Wood, over Birmingham, over the Midlands. It lingered in quiet streets, in classrooms where their friends would have been, in homes that would never hear their laughter again. The boys' disappearance reshaped lives. Trust shifted. Communities watched over children differently. The estate itself seemed to carry the weight of what had been lost. A subtle tension in the air, the unspoken fear that what happened once could happen again. And through it all, the families waited, not just for answers, but for a moment of closure that might never come. Two boys gone, a world changed, and a silence that refused to be broken. Years after the searches ended, the case found a new audience. Television crews returned to Chelmsley Wood with cameras, lighting rigs, and familiar questions. Streets that had once been searched by hand were now filmed in slow, deliberate shots. The petrol station, the pathways, the places where time had stopped. Documentary makers promised fresh eyes. They reopened files, interviewed retired detectives, spoke to journalists who had followed the case from the beginning. For the first time in years, the story of David Spencer and Patrick Warren was being told not as breaking news, but as history, examined carefully, piece by piece. Programs like In the Footsteps of Killers brought the disappearance back into public conversation. Viewers who had never heard the boys' names were suddenly hearing them for the first time. Old photographs were held up again, timelines redrawn, suspects discussed with measured caution. For the families, it was a double-edged sword. Every broadcast meant renewed hope that someone watching might recognize something, remember a detail they'd buried long ago. But it also meant reliving the night everything changed again and again under studio lights and narration. The documentaries didn't solve the case, but they did something else. They reminded people that this wasn't just an old story. It wasn't finished. It hadn't been resolved. Two boys were still missing, and the questions were still open. And somewhere, possibly someone was watching, knowing exactly what happened after midnight, knowing why the red bicycle was left behind, knowing why no one ever came back. This is where certainty ends. There are no final sightings, no confirmed route, no moment that can be pointed to and named as the turning point. Everything that comes after the petrol station exists only as possibility. One theory suggests the boys were intercepted shortly after leaving the forecourt. A car pulling in, a voice calling out, someone offering a lift, directions, help. Two children, tired, cold, trusting, stepping into a situation they didn't understand. Another possibility is that they were followed, watched as they left the light and walked back into the dark. The abandoned bicycle would fit that idea, something left behind in haste, something that didn't matter anymore once control had been taken. There are darker theories too, that whoever was responsible knew the area, knew the shortcuts, knew where to go to avoid being seen, that the lack of witnesses wasn't luck, it was intention. But none of these can be proven. Police have always been careful with this part of the story. Speculation can easily become accusation, and without evidence, theory becomes noise. What matters is what can be said with confidence. Two boys vanished within minutes of being seen, and they did not leave by choice. They didn't run away together. They didn't abandon their belongings. They didn't disappear into thin air. Something happened. And whatever that something was, it happened fast, quietly, and without leaving behind the kind of clues investigators rely on. The absence of evidence doesn't mean the absence of a crime. It means the truth was taken with them. What remains are fragments, a time, a place, a bicycle behind bins, and the knowledge that somewhere between the petrol station lights and the darkness beyond, David Spencer and Patrick Warren crossed a line they never came back from. Nearly 3 decades have passed, but the night has never ended. The questions are still the same ones that were asked in the days after Boxing Day, 1996, only now they carry the weight of time. Why were David Spencer and Patrick Warren out after midnight at all, and did someone notice them because of it? Why was Patrick's red Apollo bicycle left behind, hidden, undamaged? Why did no one hear anything? No argument, no shout, no sudden disturbance in a place where sound usually travels. And perhaps the hardest question of all, how do two boys disappear from their own neighborhood without leaving a single trace? There are no remains to bury, no answers to accept, no ending to process. For the families, the case has never moved into the past. It exists in a permanent present, a loop of waiting, hoping, and bracing for disappointment. Every anniversary brings the same thought. Someone knows. Someone saw something and didn't realize its importance. Someone heard something and dismissed it, or someone has carried the truth in silence for years. The investigation remains open, not active, not closed, waiting. And as long as that file exists, the story of David Spencer and Patrick Warren isn't finished. It lingers in the quiet spaces, in estates like Chelmsley Wood, in petrol stations after midnight, in the moments when ordinary nights turn into something else entirely. This wasn't a mystery that demanded attention with violence or spectacle. It demanded it with absence.